Israeli trucks and rollers are shown in this video. Building a new buffer zone called the Philadelphia Corridor and paving a new road along the Gaza-Egypt border, it seems that Israel is planning to remain here. During the day, new realities are being built that allude to Israel's endgame for Gaza. Zooming out, we can see Israel building road networks all across the Gaza Strip, with some being kilometers wide, including a buffer zone around the edges of the enclave. These will be fortified with checkpoints, watchtowers, bases, and other surveillance tools. Using these strategic corridors, the Israeli army will be able to monitor any point in Gaza without necessarily occupying the entire territory. The idea is that in post-war Gaza, whenever Hamas fighters surface from underground and prepare to fire rockets, the Israelis would detect them in no more than a few minutes and launch a counter-strike. The Israeli leadership believes these corridors would make further Hamas transgressions improbable in the long term, or at least decrease the damage they can inflict. The Palestinian civilian population would be able to return, though they would reside within smaller chunks of territory, each disconnected from the other. Conflict is like that: the hand that wins gets to draw the map. Meanwhile, a second front has gone hot in the north. Israeli forces have entered Lebanese territory and Iran responded by firing missiles at Israel. The Israeli master plan for Gaza is moving forward at full speed, even if the combat space is growing and all attention are elsewhere. After Iran's missile strike on Israel, I requested Ground News to fund this film because I honestly think that in situations like these, seeing both perspectives is paramount. In all, almost 600 pieces were published globally. Although I like being able to see viewpoints from both Israel and Iran, Sinai's right hand with everything going on in Lebanon and around the world, a story as important as this will simply get lost in the background noise, so I appreciate that Ground News surfaces that these kinds of stories go to ground. Rahi Mushdar and other important officials are now confirmed to have been killed in an airstrike. One by one, Israel is eliminating the current Hamas leadership. Only a few dozen articles were published on this. Caspian News. Either scan the QR code on the screen for further information. When you subscribe, you'll get 40% off the Vantage plan, which is the one I use. Additionally, you'll be directly supporting my channel since our aims coincide. I really enjoy our ongoing relationship since YouTube profits alone don't pay the costs to create these films. The link is below, so please check it out. While negotiating a political minefield behind closed doors, Israel and Hamas are engaged in open combat. The arrangements of Israeli buffer zones inside Gaza, in the form of extrajudicial corridors, of which Netanyahu is adamant about 2, but there are 3 already under construction and 2 more on the horizon, are the focal point of most negotiations. With these corridors, Israel will be able to permanently control life in Gaza while allowing its troops the freedom to move quickly throughout the enclave. The Philadelphia Corridor, which splits Egypt's Sinai region and Gaza's Rafah municipality and stretches from the Mediterranean Sea to the Kar Shalom crossing, which serves as the meeting point of Gaza, has been one of the main points of contention in the negotiations thus far. It is approximately 14 kilometers long and 100 meters wide. Both Israel and Egypt. The corridor also includes the Rafah crossing, which is the only point of transit between Egypt and Gaza. However, under the terms of the 1979 agreement, Israel was permitted to station limited military forces in the corridor, up to 4 infantry battalions with the necessary equipment, but not tanks, artillery, or anti-aircraft missiles. As a result, the operation of the Philadelphia Corridor was primarily coordinated by Egypt, and this arrangement formed a fundamental part of the Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty in 2005. Israel withdrew its army from Gaza as part of a disengagement plan, which included the evacuation of roughly 9,000 Israeli settlers who were living in 25 illegal settlements in Gaza. Following the signing of a second formal agreement between Egypt and Israel, Egypt took exclusive control of the Philadelphia Corridor, and the Palestinian Authority was eventually incorporated into the mission, authorizing the former to send out 750 border guards to patrol the region for non-military and counter-terrorism objectives. Egypt took on more responsibilities, now having to deal with stopping infiltration and smuggling. 2 years later, in 2007, Hamas overthrew the Palestinian Authority and established a total blockade of the Gaza Strip. In response, Israel implemented a land, air, and sea blockade, meaning that no one could enter or exit the region without Israeli approval. Meanwhile, Egypt would periodically open the Rafah crossing, leaving the Gaza Strip trapped between Egypt and Israel during that period. After considering other options, Hamas decided to try something different. It began constructing tunnels between Gaza and Egypt's Sinai Peninsula. The vast network of tunnels was used to smuggle weapons and goods, and between 2011 and 2015, Egyptian forces destroyed over 2,000 of them, and those were just the passages that were discovered using them. The reality that Hamas imposed on the ground was that the tunnels were not under the jurisdiction of either Egypt or Israel, and that the Rafah crossing was no longer the only way to enter and depart Gaza. After taking back control of the corridor in May 2024, Israel is now insisting on staying there to prevent Hamas from regaining the resources it lost. Netanyahu and his cabinet have identified the Philadelphia corridor and the Hamas tunnels running underneath as the single weakest link in the chain surrounding Gaza. Netanyahu's cabinet claims that if Israel does not maintain control over the Philadelphia corridor, Hamas would quickly rearm it, bolstering its military might and infrastructure, making Gaza a long-term security risk for the state of Israel. Though Hamas has a different perspective, its negotiators insist that as part of an ongoing truce, all Israeli soldiers must leave the corridor and the territory must be restored to Hamas sovereignty. Egypt claims that a long-term, extensive Israeli military presence in the region would be a violation of the 1979 peace treaty, and they have a point. Egypt is also unhappy by Israel's continuous presence in the corridor. Since May, a number of compromises have been proposed, including the withdrawal of the majority of Israeli forces in exchange for the installation of Israeli watchtowers along the border. However, Egypt has rejected the idea. Israel feels that it must ensure the security of its border communities, so they're going about it unilaterally by paving the entirety of the corridor, effectively giving Israel control over the area. The Philadelphia corridor has served as a buffer zone between Egypt and Israel for more than 40 years. Corridor Israel wants to eliminate Hamas in Gaza and make sure that there is never another build-up that takes over control of the Philadelphia. That design requires the corridor, but it is not the only component. Towards the north is the NSR Rim. The name Narim is a hint about what lies ahead. Originally an illegal Israeli settlement before Israel withdrew from the Gaza Strip in 2005, the reintroduction of the name suggests that the Israelis may consider resuming efforts to build new settlements in Gaza. The corridor was established as a result of the current hostilities and measures approximately 6 kilometers in length and 2 kilometers in width. It also bisects Gaza City from the rest of the Strip. A few senior, a minimum of 5 advanced military posts are located along the Narim corridor, which is proposed by Israeli ministers like Bania. These sites are used to monitor and regulate people's movement between northern and southern Gaza. Israeli boots on the ground appear to be permanent, judging by the construction of these outposts and the massive clearing of land nearby. This will allow Israel to maintain control over life in Gaza even after the current hostilities end and Palestinian civilians return to their homes, or what's left of them, without having to occupy the entire region. According to Netanyahu, Israel would not leave the Philadelphia and Narim corridors, which include the Rafah crossing, in the event of a ceasefire. Palestinian officials claim that Netanyahu introduced these negotiating objectives to sabotage the peace negotiations and oppose the buffer zones in both corridors. The primary barrier to a ceasefire agreement is now this, although even the Americans are finding it difficult to negotiate on the additional issues. Although the UN Security Council resolutions and the Biden-approved plan for discussions both failed to address Israeli presence in the Philadelphia and Narim corridors, Netanyahu continues to insist on enforcing the restrictions as just polite recommendations. A third buffer zone is now being developed by the Israeli government in the meantime. A new corridor is likely to pass through this territory, which marks one of the narrowest points in the Gaza Strip. It will directly connect Israeli forces to Khan Younis, allowing Israeli boots on the ground within minutes. Israeli forces have taken control of the port of Khan Yunis and have vacated and cleared the stretch of territory going towards the Israeli town of Kisufim. Buildings have been destroyed and much of the earth has been flattened here. The Kisufim corridor's breadth is unknown, however, by using these 3 buffer zones, its layouts may end up resembling the Naram corridor. Although the Gaza Strip is essentially split into 3 sections by the Philadelphia, Naram and Kisufim corridors, that is not the end of it. It's possible that Israel is planning yet another corridor through here, going diagonally across the Rafah and Khan Yunis municipalities. If successful, this would further enhance Israeli control over the movements of people and goods by severing the Rafah crossing from Khan Yunis. However, the outcome of the hostilities and negotiations remains to be seen. In August 2024, doctors from around the world reported that Israeli forces operating in the humanitarian zone had moved civilian and aid workers elsewhere, reducing the safe zone size. Later forward, it may be possible to build additional Israeli military facilities along this nameless corridor. It is still too early to say anything definitive about the 2 diagonal corridors, but Israeli hardliners have expressed support for such blueprints. There is also talk of building a 5th corridor to divide the town of Panan from Gaza City. This 5th corridor would also run diagonally, creating a small pocket of territory that could possibly be designated for Israeli resettlement. In other words, Israel is turning Gaza like a fish tank with monitoring on all sides completely in its struggle against Hamas. The combination of these 3, probably 5, corridors would allow Israeli troops to watch any place in the Gaza Strip and react to any danger within minutes. Israel has played the long game, some will call it the slow game. It has now effectively reduced Hamas from an army capable of firing 1,000 rockets a hour to an insurgency that can fire a dozen rockets on special occasions. For the Israelis, the key is now to prevent Hamas from regrouping and replenishing its resources. In theory, any time a Hamas fighter emerges from the underground tunnels, they would have no more than a few minutes to set up and launch a rocket before disappearing. Those are the terms the corridors impose on Gaza. However, blueprints rarely survive the build. While Israel's endgame for Gaza could see both the return of Palestinian civilians as well as the return of Israeli settlers, the corridors would become lightning rods for future attacks. They also don't address the fundamental issues between Israelis and Palestinians. Antagonism between the 2 communities will persist, if not worsen. So while the map will bend and change, unity will stay in place.